Imagine looking at a massive, incredibly complex global leaderboard.
Right, like the ultimate scorecard of human progress.
Exactly. We were talking about the list where every nation on Earth is just fiercely competing to prove they provide the absolute best possible life for their citizens.
And I mean, if you look at the top of that list, you usually see exactly what you'd expect to see.
Yeah, you see the traditional heavyweights, the massive industrial superpowers, the nations with, centuries of accumulated wealth, just flexing their sheer economic might.
Right.
But as you scroll down this leaderboard, you notice something incredible. Suddenly, a middle-income country, a relatively small island nation, leapfrogs 21 places ahead of its direct competitors.
Which is a massive jump.
It's huge. It absolutely surges past nations that have vastly larger economies and much deeper pockets.
Yeah.
And the kicker, it does this not by, discovering a massive new oil reserve or by suddenly doubling its manufacturing output.
Right, it's not a resource boom.
Exactly. It does it by fundamentally exposing a flaw in how the entire world measures success.
It really forces us to completely reevaluate the prevailing global consensus. I mean, for the better part of a century, the equation we used to judge a country was almost aggressively simple.
Oh, totally. Raw wealth equaled human development.
Exactly. If a nation possessed a high gross domestic product, the international community simply assumed its citizens were thriving.
Yeah, we rarely questioned the underlying mechanics of that wealth.
No, and we certainly didn't question the environmental devastation or the profound social inequalities left in the wake of that rapid economic growth.
Right.
But the data we're examining today proves that this old one-dimensional model is not just outdated, it's actively obscuring reality.
And that reality is exactly what we're here to unpack today. Because, if you are listening to this, you're likely the kind of person who wants to understand where the world is actually heading without getting completely buried under an avalanche of academic jargon.
Right, you want the actual mechanics of how societies are changing.
Exactly. So today, our mission for this deep dive is to completely deconstruct what we are calling the Jamaica paradox.
It's a fascinating case study.
It really is. We're diving into the comprehensive Jamaica Human Development Report, which is this massive data set spanning from 1990 all the way to 2023.
And specifically focusing on this highly disruptive theme of equity and sustainability beyond growth.
Right, because Jamaica serves as an unparalleled real-world laboratory for this. The traditional economic metrics entirely fail to capture what is actually happening on the ground there.
They completely miss the mark. We're going to look at a society where the demographic realities have, completely inverted.
Yeah, where women are fundamentally outpacing men in key developmental areas like academic achievement and life expectancy.
And perhaps most crucially, we'll see how the true green cost of economic growth is radically redefining what it actually means to be a successful modern nation in the 21st century.
So to really grasp the sheer scale of what Jamaica is doing, we have to change how we look at the data.
We need a new diagnostic framework.
Exactly. Usually when we talk about a country's success, we just look through one lens. The lens of pure cash. It's a gross national income.
Right.
But today, we're going to look through a multidimensional diagnostic framework. Think of it like taking a country into a clinic for a full-body scan.
I like that analogy.
Right. We aren't just checking the pulse. We are checking the nervous system, the skeletal structure, the metabolic rate. We're going to use 5 distinct lenses to look at this society.
That multidimensional approach is absolutely essential. A single metric can easily be manipulated or skewed by outliers.
Oh, for sure.
But a composite of 5 interconnected indices reveals the undeniable structural truths of a nation.
Okay, so let's break them down. Lens number 1 is the HDI, the Human Development Index. This is our foundational baseline.
Right, it measures 3 basic things: health, education, and standard of living.
Exactly. Then lens number 2 is the GDI, the Gender Development Index. This splits the data to show us the exact developmental balance or imbalance between men and women.
And that particular lens is going to reveal a demographic shift that is completely counter to what most people assume about developing economies.
It really is. Then we have lens number 3, the GII, or Gender Inequality Index.
Right.
This is where we look at the systemic friction in a society. It measures reproductive health, political empowerment, and who actually gets to participate in the labor force.
The actual friction on the ground.
Yeah. Then lens number 4 is the IHDI, the Inequality-Adjusted HDI. I always think of this one as the leaky bucket.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah, it shows us exactly how much of a country's raw progress is bleeding out and being lost because of the wealth gap between the absolute richest and the absolute poorest citizens.
It's a very sobering metric because it visualizes the stark difference between a nation's potential and its lived reality.
Exactly. And finally, lens number 5, which is the absolute key to solving our leaderboard mystery, the PHDI.
The planetary pressures adjusted HDI.
Right. This looks at the environmental exhaust pipe. It measures the ecological cost, the carbon emissions, and the raw material footprint of all this human development.
So we have our baseline progress, our gender balance, our systemic friction, our internal inequality leaks, and our environmental cost.
A rigorous diagnostic framework.
Yeah.
And to truly unravel this Jamaica paradox, we have to begin with that first lens.
Right, the baseline trajectory.
Yeah, we need to establish Jamaica's baseline speed over the last 3 decades. How has the Foundational Human Development Index actually evolved from the global shifts of 1990 to the post-pandemic reality of 2023?
Well, let's lay out the timeline, because it has definitely not been a smooth, linear climb.
No, when you look at the raw data, the journey is full of turbulence.
Indeed. Back in 1990, as the Cold War was ending and globalization was rapidly accelerating, Jamaica's HDI stood at 0.662.
Okay.
Over the course of the next 33 years, they managed to push that number up to 0.720 by 2023. Now, in the realm of developmental economics, that crosses a highly significant threshold. It officially places Jamaica into the high human development tier.
That's a big deal.
It is. But the fascinating part isn't just the final number, it's the specific historical friction they encountered along the way.
Yeah, because the trend line has this very obvious, highly stubborn plateau right around the turn of the millennium.
Right, the early 2000s.
Yeah, from 2000 to about 2003, the index essentially flatlines. It barely ticks from 0.659 to roughly 0.660.
It just stalled?
Exactly. What exactly was happening internally that caused the developmental engine to just stall out for 3 years?
That plateau is a textbook example of the vulnerability inherent in middle-income island economies. During that specific window, Jamaica was undergoing severe domestic economic restructuring while simultaneously being battered by global market volatility.
So a perfect storm.
Precisely. You had shifts in global trade agreements, fluctuations in the prices of key exports, and the incredibly heavy burden of national debt servicing.
Oh, the debt is always a killer.
It is. When a nation is spending a massive portion of its revenue just to service historical debt, the capital required to invest in hospitals and schools, the very engines of HDI, simply evaporates.
So they were basically running on a treadmill just to stay in the exact same place.
Exactly.
But they eventually broke out of that stagnation. What really caught my eye, though, was the massive shockwave that hit them much more recently, between 2019 and 2021.
Ah, yes. The compounding crises of the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerating global environmental pressures.
Right. In 2019, they had fought their way up to an HDI of 0.716, and the bottom falls out.
Tourism stops, supply chains freeze.
Exactly. And their HDI drops back down to 0.703 by 2021.
Which, we must acknowledge, was a universal phenomenon. Across the globe, years, sometimes even decades, of developmental progress were erased in a matter of months.
Yeah, nobody escaped that drop.
No one. But what separates a resilient society from a fragile one is the elasticity of its recovery. Jamaica didn't just slowly crawl back. They demonstrated remarkable systemic elasticity, rebounding past their pre-pandemic peak to hit that 0.720 mark by 2023.
Which brings them to a global ranking of 115th on the traditional scale.
Correct.
So, for you listening, think about what it actually means to live in a high human development country. It means there's a foundational floor beneath the citizens.
A basic standard of living.
Exactly. But here is where the data gets incredibly bizarre. We have to put Jamaica on the global coordinate system and compare them to the rest of the world.
This is exactly where the paradox begins to materialize. Because the contrast between their human development and their raw economic power is jarring.
Okay, so let's break this down. Jamaica's HDI is 0.720. The global average is 0.756.
Right.
So they are just a tiny bit below the global average for overall human development.
Just slightly.
But let's look at the actual money in the bank. Jamaica's gross national income per capita is roughly $10,000, adjusted for local purchasing power.
And the global average.
It's over $20,000.
Their national income is quite literally half the global average.
Wait, I have to stop and unpack the mechanics of this because the math feels wrong.
It does seem contradictory.
If a country has literally 50% less money circulating in its economy than the global average, How on earth are they keeping their health and education scores so high?
Right.
How do you buy a high quality of life with half the cash?
The mechanism at play here is known as developmental compensation. Jamaica provides an absolute masterclass in how to efficiently convert a relatively small economic footprint into highly durable human outcomes.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, remember that the HDI isn't just a measure of bank accounts. It is equally weighted by life expectancy and educational access. Let's look at the health metric. Jamaica's life expectancy at birth is 71.5 years.
Okay.
The global average is 73.4 years.
That is wild. They have half the income, but their citizens are living almost exactly as long as the global average.
Yes.
How are they physically achieving that?
It comes down to prioritizing public health infrastructure and community-level preventative care over highly privatized, expensive, reactive medicine.
Ah, so catching things early.
Exactly. When a nation with limited resources focuses heavily on foundational health maternal care, vaccination programs, community health workers, they can drastically reduce early mortality rates.
Which pulls the whole average up.
Right. They are extracting an incredibly high amount of human longevity out of every single dollar they spend. It fundamentally dismantles the deeply entrenched capitalist assumption that you need a massive, hyperinflated GDP to keep a population alive and thriving.
I really want you to think about that in the context of your own country. Does your nation possess a massive multi-trillion-dollar GDP, but you're actively watching your life expectancy drop because of systemic health crises?
It's a very relevant question right now.
It is, because Jamaica is executing the exact opposite strategy. They are converting a very modest national income into a highly resilient, durable population.
And a huge component of that durability comes from the second pillar of their development, education.
Which brings us to lens number 2, the GDI. And honestly, this is where the data completely shattered my expectations.
The Gender Development Index. This is the specific metric where the Jamaica paradox transitions from being merely interesting to being globally unique.
It really does. We just established that education and health are the mechanisms Jamaica uses to offset their lower income.
Right.
But when you apply the gender lens and look at who is accumulating all this human capital, the entire narrative flips upside down.
We're looking at a demographic inversion.
Yes. Jamaica's Gender Development Index is 1.013.
To give the listener the precise context here, a GDI value of exactly 1.0 represents perfect statistical parity between men and women across health, education, and income.
Right.
Most of the developing world, and frankly a significant portion of the highly developed world, struggles immensely to even approach 1.0. Historically, the metric is almost always skewed to favor men.
But Jamaica isn't just approaching parity. They are at 1.013.
Which is remarkable.
A number over 1.0 explicitly means that women are statistically outpacing men in these core areas. They haven't just caught up to the starting line. They are winning the race.
This specific achievement places Jamaica firmly in what the United Nations classifies as Group 1 countries.
Which is what exactly?
It's a highly exclusive tier reserved for nations with the absolute highest levels of gender parity, and it is crucial to understand that this is not some brief post-pandemic statistical anomaly.
Right, it's a trend.
Exactly. The historical data shows that Jamaica has maintained a GDI above 1.0 consistently since 2008. We are looking at a deeply entrenched, multi-generational structural reality.
So let's look at the actual mechanics of how this happens, specifically in the classroom, because it looks less like a gradual shift and more like an academic arms race.
It does.
Let's look at the expected years of schooling. For a young woman in Jamaica today, the expectation is that she will spend 13.5 years in the educational system.
Okay.
For a young man, that expectation drops to 11.3 years.
That is a massive 2.2-year gap right out of the gate.
And that expectation becomes concrete reality when we measure the mean years of schooling, the actual realized time spent in education by the adult population.
Right. What are those numbers?
Women sit at 10.2 years, while men are at 9.6 years.
In the slow-moving world of demographic statistics, a gap of that magnitude is cavernous.
I visualize this like a massive societal relay race. The female runners in Jamaica are basically being handed a 2-year head start in academic and intellectual capital.
They are the ones staying in the system.
Exactly. Accumulating the degrees, the technical certifications, the specialized knowledge at a radically higher rate than their male counterparts.
But I have to ask why. Why are the young men dropping out of the system?
That is the crucial sociological question. The data points toward intense socioeconomic pressures that uniquely impact young men in certain developing economies.
Like what kind of pressures? Well, In Jamaica, there is often a powerful cultural and economic pull toward the informal economy. The need to generate immediate short-term cash to support themselves or their families.
Oh, I see.
The long-term delayed gratification of formal education is frequently abandoned in favor of immediate, albeit lower wage, labor.
And for the women.
Conversely, for many young women, formal education is culturally recognized as the single most reliable, essential escape route from poverty or deeply entrenched domestic reliance.
Wow.
The societal messaging pushes women into the classroom and men into the immediate workforce.
So you have this dynamic where the intellectual reserve of the entire nation is overwhelmingly female. What does that actually do to the fabric of a society?
It changes everything.
Right. Think about the dating pool, the marriage dynamics, the household structures. You are going to have a society where the women are consistently the most highly educated people in the room.
It creates a profound shift in household power dynamics. When women hold the dominant share of intellectual capital, you typically see a strengthening of matriarchal community structures.
Makes sense.
You see shifts in how family resources are allocated, usually with a higher prioritization on the health and education of the next generation. It fundamentally alters the DNA of the community.
Right. So logically, if the women are hoarding all this intellectual capital, you would absolutely expect them to be the primary breadwinners.
You would.
You would expect them to be the CEOs, the corporate directors, the ones single-handedly driving the national economy forward. You would expect the formal workforce to be utterly dominated by women.
And yet, this is exactly where the empirical data sharply contradicts our logical assumptions.
It's so strange.
The narrative hits a massive systemic bottleneck.
This brings us to lens number 3, the GII, or Gender Inequality Index, where we specifically look for friction in the system.
Right.
And the biggest point of friction is the labor force participation rate. Despite having this massive 2-year educational advantage, the female participation rate in the formal labor force is only 60.6%.
While male participation, despite their lower educational attainment, is 72.4%.
That is an almost 12 percentage point drop-off for women.
It's a glaring disparity.
Okay, let me stop you there and play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If there is a 12% drop in female labor participation, couldn't that just mean a large portion of these highly educated women are migrating out of the country for better paying jobs?
The brain drain argument.
Yeah, we know brain drain is a huge issue in the Caribbean. Are they just taking their Jamaican degrees to New York or London?
Brain drain and emigration are undeniably significant factors for the Jamaican economy as a whole, but they do not sufficiently explain this specific internal gender disparity.
Why not?
If emigration were the sole cause, we would see a relatively equal drop-off in both male and female domestic participation. The fact that the gap is specifically gendered points to deep structural domestic friction.
Okay, so what is causing the friction?
We have to look at two distinct local mechanisms.
Okay, what is the first mechanism?
The first is the existence of a highly rigid structural glass ceiling within the domestic corporate culture. While women are acquiring the necessary degrees, the institutional pathways to upper management, executive leadership, and high-tier economic roles remain disproportionately controlled by historical male networks.
So they get the master's degree, but they hit a brick wall when they try to enter the boardroom.
Exactly. The academic keys are not unlocking the corporate doors.
That's incredibly frustrating. What's the second factor?
The second factor is often far more pervasive and insidious: the invisible, unpaid burden of household and caregiving responsibilities.
The double burden.
Precisely. A woman in Jamaica might hold advanced academic qualifications, but if the state lacks a robust infrastructure for affordable childcare or elder care, and if deeply ingrained cultural norms dictate that domestic labor is solely her domain,
Then she can't actually go to work.
right, she is effectively forced out of the formal, paid economy. Her immense intellectual capital is sidelined by systemic logistical failures.
It's like a country spending millions of dollars building a fleet of high-performance sports cars and then leaving them all parked in the garage because nobody bothered to build any roads.
That's a perfect analogy.
You have this massive national reserve of talent that isn't being allowed to drive the economy forward. But it's not all parked in the garage, is it?
No, it is not.
Because while they might be locked out of the corporate world, they are absolutely storming the political world.
That is the fascinating counterweight in the data. The political sphere provides a stark contrast to the labor statistics.
It really does.
Despite the severe economic friction, female political empowerment in Jamaica has experienced a seismic, undeniable paradigm shift.
Look at the share of women in the Jamaican parliament. If we go back to 1990, it was sitting at a mere 12.3%.
Very low.
And for decades, it barely moved. It was just stagnant. But then you look at the recent data, and there's this massive, sudden surge.
Right around 2020.
Yeah, between 2020 and 2023, the share of female parliamentarians leaps up and holds incredibly steady at exactly 31.0%. It almost tripled.
In political science, we view that 31% mark not just as an improvement, but as a definitive structural policy breakthrough.
Why is 31% the magic number?
There is a recognized concept of critical mass in legislative bodies. When a marginalized group reaches roughly the 30% threshold, they transition from being a token minority whose voices can be easily marginalized into a formidable voting bloc.
Ah, they actually have the votes to change things.
Exactly. They gain the actual leverage required to fundamentally alter the legislative agenda of the nation.
And what happens when women get 31% of the legislative power? They start writing laws that protect women.
Naturally.
You can actually trace the impact of that political power directly into the foundational health metrics. This ties perfectly into the reproductive health component of the index. Overall, Jamaica's gender inequality index dropped by a massive 20% over the last 3 decades.
And we must emphasize that a 20% improvement in this specific index translates directly to saved lives and vastly expanded personal agency.
Definitely.
The most striking evidence of this is the dramatic plunge in the adolescent birth rate.
The numbers here are just staggering. In 1990, the adolescent birth rate was 103 per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
That is incredibly high.
It is. But by 2023, that number had plummeted down to just 36.5.
That represents nearly a 2/3 reduction in teen pregnancies. We have to explicitly connect the sociological dots here.
Okay, let's connect them.
When young women are provided with reproductive health care, education, and agency, they do not become mothers in their teenage years. Consequently, they do not drop out of high school.
They stay in the system.
They stay in the educational system. This directly fuels that metric we discussed earlier, the 13.5 expected years of schooling.
Oh, wow. It all loops together.
It does. Furthermore, alongside this, Jamaica has managed to keep the maternal mortality ratio at 99 per 100,000 live births, ensuring that when women do choose to have children, the process is increasingly medically secure.
It creates this incredibly powerful, self-sustaining feedback loop. You empower women politically. Those female politicians push for better reproductive health care and education access.
Right.
The young girls stay in school longer, they avoid early pregnancy, they get more educated, which leads to them eventually demanding more political power.
It is a virtuous cycle.
Even if the traditional corporate labor market is lagging behind, the structural foundation of the society is being completely rebuilt.
It is a profound transformation. However, if we are to truly understand the Jamaica paradox, we cannot merely celebrate the victories.
Right. We have to look at the dark side of the data.
We must transition to the fourth lens of our diagnostic framework and confront the deeply entrenched forces that are actively fighting against this progress. We must examine the mechanisms that are quietly siphoning away the nation's potential.
This brings us to lens number 4, the IHDI, or the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index. This is where we look at how the distribution of wealth and resources acts as a silent thief.
The IHDI is arguably the most sobering and analytically crucial metric in the entire United Nations framework.
Why is that?
It operates on a very simple yet devastating mathematical premise. If you take a country's total developmental achievements, all the health, all the education, all the income, and you distribute it perfectly equally among every single citizen, the nation's HDI score remains exactly the same.
Right.
However, the moment there is inequality, the moment resources are hoarded by a few while others are deprived, the index actively penalizes the score. The number drops to reflect the actual lived reality of the average person.
This is where my leaky bucket analogy comes in perfectly. Jamaica spends decades doing all this incredibly hard work to build up a solid baseline HDI of 0.720.
Right, they fill the bucket.
They are pouring all this fantastic educational and health potential into the national bucket, but the bucket is fundamentally cracked.
Severe structural cracks.
Yeah. When you apply the inequality adjustment, when you calculate the IHDI, the value plummets down to 0.590.
That is a steep drop.
It means the bucket is leaking 18.1% of its total volume. Nearly a fifth of their entire national progress is just bleeding out onto the floor, completely wasted because of internal disparities.
And the true analytical power of the IHDI is that it doesn't just tell us the bucket is leaking. It acts as a diagnostic tool that shows us precisely where the holes are located.
Okay.
The loss is not uniform across all sectors of society. When we dissect the specific dimensions of inequality in Jamaica, a highly actionable, highly revealing picture emerges.
Let's look at the holes in the bucket then. The leak caused by education inequality is actually just a tiny drip. It only accounts for a 5.6% loss.
Which is relatively small.
And logically, that makes perfect sense based on what we just discussed about the massive expansion of schooling, particularly for women.
Exactly.
The educational system, while perhaps not perfect, is relatively equitable in terms of basic access. Almost everyone is getting into a classroom.
Yeah.
But then you look at income inequality, and that is the massive gaping hole in the bottom of the bucket. Income inequality accounts for a devastating 33.7% loss.
If we extrapolate this to the broader socioeconomic reality, it demands a complete paradigm shift from Jamaican policymakers.
How so?
Well, for the last 50 years, the primary mandate for developing nations was access. Build more schools, hire more teachers, get children into classrooms.
Right.
The data clearly shows that Jamaica has, by and large, won that specific battle. The existential societal challenge they face today is no longer about educational access. It is almost exclusively about bridging the stark, highly calcified chasm between the wealthy elite and the working poor.
But wait, if they solve the education problem, why is the income problem still so bad? I mean,
Yeah.
shouldn't a more educated population naturally lead to a wealthier, more equal population?
In a perfectly frictionless theoretical economy.
But not in reality?
Exactly. In reality, income inequality is rarely just about who has a degree. It is about generational wealth, the ownership of physical assets like land and real estate, and the stark divide between the formal and informal economies.
Oh, that makes sense.
A significant portion of Jamaica's population may be educated, but if they are forced to work in the informal sector, without labor protections, without benefits, without the ability to accumulate capital or secure bank loans, their education does not translate into wealth generation.
Because the system is rigged against them.
The system is designed to reward existing capital, not newly minted diplomas.
So the wealth gap is essentially neutralizing their educational gains. It's deeply frustrating. You have this highly educated population that is systemically locked out of the financial rewards of their own intelligence.
It is a massive structural flaw.
But when we talk about this gap, and we talk about the people at the absolute bottom of it, we have to be very careful about how we define that bottom. How do we actually define what poverty looks like in Jamaica today?
That is a critical distinction, and it requires us to utilize another specialized tool within our framework, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
Because the old way of measuring poverty is broken.
Completely. Historically, traditional economics measured poverty using a blunt, highly flawed instrument, the arbitrary financial poverty line.
Right.
The logic was binary. If a citizen earns $1 above the line, they are considered financially secure. If they earn $1 below it, they are classified as poor.
Which is an incredibly lazy way to measure actual human suffering. It tells you nothing about their actual life.
Exactly. It ignores the nuance of deprivation. The MPI, however, examines poverty through multiple overlapping lenses simultaneously.
Okay, so it looks at the whole picture.
Yes. It evaluates health, education, and living standards concurrently. It asks specific, granular questions. Is the household deprived of clean drinking water? Do they lack access to electricity? Are they suffering from systemic malnutrition? Are school-age children absent from the classroom?
So if I say the words extreme poverty, I know what image pops into your head. You probably picture absolute destitution. You know, people living without housing, communities without running water, children entirely locked out of the school system.
That is the common perception.
But the MTI data for Jamaica completely subverts that expectation. The report reveals something truly remarkable. Extreme multidimensional poverty has been almost entirely eradicated across the island.
It's quite an achievement.
The incidence rate currently sits at a microscopic 2.8%.
For a middle-income country, navigating the complexities of the global economy, achieving an extreme poverty rate of 2.8% is a phenomenal, highly commendable policy achievement.
It truly is. But we have to look closer. Because within that tiny 2.8% of the population that is still trapped in multidimensional poverty, what is actually causing their suffering?
Right. What are the actual deprivations?
The data breaks it down factor by factor.
Right.
And it completely shatters our preconceived notions. The deprivation is not caused by a lack of housing. Inadequate housing only contributes 6.1% to the poverty index. It is not a lack of drinking water, which contributes only 6.5%, and it is certainly not a lack of educational access, which contributes just 10.5%.
So what is the primary driver?
The overwhelming dominant force keeping that specific 2.8% trapped in poverty is undernourishment. It contributes a staggering 52.2% to the poverty index.
Wow, over 50%.
I really want to make sure you grasp the gravity of this insight. Over half of the extreme poverty profile in Jamaica isn't about people lacking a roof or a school book. It is entirely driven by people simply not getting enough calories or essential nutrients.
And this requires us to understand the complex mechanisms of food insecurity in middle-income nations.
Right, because how does that happen?
How does a country with adequate housing and high education rates still have starving citizens? It often stems from a high reliance on imported processed foods and a vulnerability to global supply chain shocks.
Oh, so they aren't growing their own food.
If a nation does not prioritize domestic subsistence agriculture, its poorest citizens become entirely beholden to the fluctuating global prices of wheat, corn, and fuel.
This means our whole concept of modern poverty is fundamentally wrong. We're picturing a lack of infrastructure, but in reality, poverty here is entirely invisible.
It's hidden in plain sight.
It's a teenager putting on a clean uniform, walking out of a house with electricity and a concrete roof, going to a good school, but secretly fasting for 2 days straight because a global supply chain issue caused local food prices to spike out of their family's reach.
That is an incredibly powerful way to frame it.
That is what poverty actually looks like in this data.
And this realization dictates a massive pivot in how governments approach social safety nets.
Right.
The empirical takeaway here is that Jamaican policymakers no longer need to rely on broad, sweeping, highly expensive, blunt force infrastructure interventions to fight poverty.
They don't need to build more pipes.
Exactly. They do not need to launch massive new public housing projects or nationwide water sanitation initiatives as their primary anti-poverty tools. The infrastructure is largely there. What they desperately require now are surgical, highly precise, hyper-targeted nutritional interventions.
We are talking about guaranteed hot meals in every single school. We were talking about highly targeted, subsidized food programs specifically for vulnerable pregnant women.
Yes.
We're talking about aggressive agricultural policies that prioritize domestic food security over export cash crops. You have to identify the exact hole in the boat and patch it, rather than just endlessly buying bigger pumps.
Precisely. It is about evolving the governance model to meet the actual granular, highly specific needs of the population as they exist today, rather than continuing to fight the infrastructural poverty battles of the 1990s.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom out for a second. We have meticulously unpacked the incredibly complex internal mechanisms of Jamaican society.
We have covered a lot of ground.
We've seen the demographic inversion of their highly educated female population. We've analyzed the bizarre, highly frustrating labor paradox that is keeping that massive talent pool locked out of the formal workforce.
The 12% drop-off.
Yep. We've examined the massive income inequality that is bleeding away 18% of their national progress, and we've redefined what poverty actually looks like on the ground.
Right.
But we still have one massive question left to answer. How does all of this internal complexity, all this struggle and friction, translate to them absolutely beating the global system?
The paradox we started with.
Exactly. How do these localized challenges result in them leapfrogging 21 places on the global leaderboard? It is finally time to solve the mystery we introduced at the very beginning of this deep dive.
To solve that specific mystery, we must finally engage the fifth and final lens of our diagnostic framework.
The PHDI.
Yes, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. The introduction of this specific metric by the United Nations represents a tectonic, philosophical shift in how the global community assesses and rewards national success.
Let me set the stage so you understand just how radical this shift is. For literally decades, the global HDI leaderboard, the ultimate list of who was winning at human development, was basically just a list of who could burn the most coal, chop down the most forests, and extract the most resources to get rich.
It was a deeply flawed system.
The entire system explicitly and aggressively rewarded countries for reckless, unabated industrialization. You could completely obliterate your local environment. You could pump massive amounts of pollution into the global atmosphere. And as long as your GDP went up and your citizens had the disposable income to buy more consumer goods, the United Nations moved you up the ranks.
It was fundamentally a leaderboard built on ecological debt.
But then they introduced the PHDI.
The PHDI was designed to fundamentally correct that disastrous historical error.
How does it work?
It takes a nation's traditional HDI score, all the health, education, and income data, and it actively discounts it based on two vital planetary pressures. First, it measures a nation's carbon dioxide emissions per capita. Second, it measures its material footprint per capita, the sheer tonnage of biomass, fossil fuels, and raw minerals extracted to sustain its lifestyle.
So it measures the actual damage.
Suddenly, for the first time in history, the environmental cost of your economic development is mathematically deducted from your overall score.
And this is exactly where Jamaica accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, we'll get to that, completely hacks the global system.
They absolutely do.
Let's look at the actual environmental exhaust they're pumping out. Jamaica's per capita CO2 emissions are a mere 2.7 tons.
Right.
For context, the global average is 4.5 tons. They are emitting nearly half the carbon of the average global citizen.
And their material footprint is equally revealing. This measures the raw consumption of the Earth. Jamaica's material footprint is just 5.2 tons per capita.
Which sounds low, but what is the comparison?
To put the sheer scale of that into perspective, highly developed, wealthy nations routinely possess material footprints exceeding 20, sometimes even 30 tons per capita.
Oh my God.
They are consuming the Earth at 5 to 6 times the rate of Jamaica.
Jamaica's living exceptionally remarkably light on the Earth. And because their economic engine places such a minuscule, almost negligible burden on the global environment, the mathematical penalty applied to their HDI score is incredibly small.
It barely registers.
The difference between their traditional unadjusted HDI and their green-adjusted PHDI is a tiny 4.7%. They barely lose any points at all, simply because they aren't destroying the planet to achieve their .720 development score.
And it is the application of this specific metric that triggers the dramatic, violent reshuffling of the global hierarchy.
Yes, this is the mechanism behind the +21 leap.
Exactly.
While the traditional hyper-developed wealthy nations, the ones deeply addicted to fossil fuels, massive overconsumption and ecological extraction absolutely plummeted down the rankings due to their massive, undeniable carbon penalties, Jamaica experiences this counterintuitive green leap.
The tables turn completely.
By simply not destroying their environment to achieve their current quality of life, their comparative global ranking effectively surges 21 places higher.
From 117th to 76th.
They move from being ranked in unimpressive 117th on the traditional polluting list all the way up to 76th on the sustainable planetary adjusted list. They jump past countries with vastly more wealth simply because they are ecologically efficient.
However, this massive statistical victory raises a profound, highly debated question within developmental economics.
What's the debate?
Is this remarkably low carbon footprint the result of intentional visionary genius? Is it a carefully crafted, deliberate policy of sustainable green development? Or is it merely the accidental byproduct of a less industrialized, slower-growing economy that relies heavily on low-emission sectors like tourism rather than heavy manufacturing?
Are they green on purpose or green by accident?
Are they green by deliberate design, or are they merely green by economic circumstance?
I see what you're saying, but does the distinction actually matter right now? Let's say it is just circumstance.
Yeah.
Let's say they are only low carbon because they haven't built 1,000 massive steel factories yet.
Okay.
If they try to fix their severe income inequality by suddenly industrializing the old-fashioned way, their emissions will inevitably spike, and they will immediately lose that incredible 21 rank advantage.
That is the risk.
But regardless of the historical cause, their current reality provides them with a massive, unprecedented competitive advantage in these new 21st century metrics. They are starting the inevitable global green transition from a baseline that incredibly wealthy countries are currently spending billions, if not trillions of dollars, desperately trying to revert to.
That is the crucial insight. They currently hold a uniquely advantageous strategic position on the global board. The challenge now is moving from circumstance to design, which requires us to ask the ultimate policy question. How can they actively leverage this position? How do we take all these incredibly complex, highly fragmented insights, the inverted gender data, the granular poverty data, the startling environmental data, and synthesize them into a coherent, actionable roadmap for the future?
Okay, let's build that roadmap. Let's synthesize everything we've uncovered in this deep dive into what we can officially call the Jamaica model.
Let's do it.
Imagine you are the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and you are staring at this multidimensional diagnostic dashboard. You have two massive, world-class strengths at your disposal.
The asset.
First, you have exceptional, globally recognized gender equity and educational attainment. You have a Group 1 GDI rating where your young women are armed with inspected 13.5 years of schooling. That is an immense reservoir of intellectual capital.
And the second asset.
Second, you have a remarkably low planetary pressure profile that grants you a massive 21-rank advantage on the global sustainability leaderboard.
Those are your strategic assets. The structural liabilities, however, are equally stark and urgent.
What are we fixing?
You face an existential need to plug the 18.1% inequality leak by systematically dismantling the barriers that cause severe income disparity.
The leaky bucket.
Exactly. And simultaneously, there is an absolute, non-negotiable necessity to break the structural glass ceilings and shift the cultural norms that are causing the 12% female labor participation gap. A nation simply cannot afford to leave its most highly educated demographics sitting on the economic sidelines.
So what is the ultimate vision? How do you take those two incredible assets and weaponize them to obliterate those liabilities? The blueprint seems to point toward one bold, highly radical idea.
Which is?
Jamaica needs to intentionally, aggressively deploy its massive, entirely underutilized reserve of highly educated women to spearhead a massive new green economic expansion.
It represents the perfect synthesis of their unique demographic and ecological reality.
Right.
If we accept that the future of the global economy relies entirely on sustainable technology, renewable energy management, and high-efficiency circular economies, we must also recognize that these specific industries require intense, highly specialized intellectual capital.
They don't require brute force.
They do not require brute manual labor. They require exactly the kind of highly educated, adaptable workforce that Jamaican women currently represent.
That is the aha moment. You take the thousands of brilliant women who are currently locked out of the old, rigid, traditional corporate structures, and you empower them, you fund them, to completely build the new green economy from the ground up.
You change the entire paradigm.
You permanently transform the national narrative from being low carbon by accidental circumstance to being high efficiency by deliberate design. You use the results of that academic arms race to design highly complex wind and solar grids.
Yes.
You use them to engineer advanced sustainable domestic agriculture to finally wipe out that 52% undernourishment problem. You use them to innovate entirely new models of high-value ecotourism.
By executing that specific strategy, you simultaneously neutralize multiple systemic crises.
You fix it all at once.
You solve the labor paradox by actively creating entirely new, forward-facing industries that do not inherently possess the entrenched glass ceilings of the legacy corporate world.
Right.
You aggressively attack the root causes of income inequality by generating high-value, sustainable, locally owned jobs. And crucially, you permanently lock in that 21-place planetary ranking advantage because you are proving that robust economic growth can be successfully decoupled from environmental destruction.
That is the Jamaica model. It isn't just a theory. It is a brilliant, entirely viable, mathematically supported path forward for a 21st century nation.
It is a blueprint for the future.
I want to sincerely thank you for coming on this intensive intellectual journey with us today. We promise to help you look past the superficial headlines and understand the actual mechanics of how the world is shifting.
And navigating the deep, intersecting complexities of gender, poverty, and climate metrics in a single nation is exactly how we achieve that.
It really is.
It requires a willingness to look far beyond the simplistic, surface-level metrics of GDP and to truly examine the complex internal mechanics and the lived realities of a society.
And as we finally wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought, something for you to deeply mull over long after you take your headphones off.
Okay.
We all know that as the global climate crisis inevitably accelerates over the next decade, the wealthiest, most powerful nations on Earth are going to be forced into a corner.
They will have to adapt.
They're going to have to spend untold trillions of dollars to artificially and painfully lower their massive carbon footprints. They're going to have to spend absolute fortunes just to drag themselves back down to the environmental baseline where Jamaica already naturally exists.
Which is a profound realization.
So think about this. If Jamaica can manage to solve its own internal income inequality, if they can figure out how to fully unleash that massive, highly educated female workforce, before the rest of the wealthy world manages to solve its self-inflicted environmental crisis.
Could they become the model?
Could this small, seemingly unassuming island nation actually become the ultimate, undisputed template for the entire future of human development?
It's entirely possible.
Look around your own community. Are you measuring the success of your own local economy by the old, toxic, polluting metrics of the past, or by the new, sustainable metrics of the future? Take a hard look at that global leaderboard and ask yourself who is actually winning the race.